My name is Frank Radis, and this is a VR panel about the issues that face directors. Thought we would try and focus a little bit on sort of the differences in actually producing content in VR than in other types of production content, whether it's the creation of graphics or it's shooting after the fact, or it's scripting, it's drama, it's comedy, is it news, is it sports, all that stuff. We're going to talk about that. But first of all, let me introduce the panel and then let them each tell you a little bit about who they are. So we have Ben Smith, who is the CEO of Laduma, a VR production company that does a lot of work globally. And then we have Tyson Sandler, who is a director. Tyson has worked with Riot Films and has lots of content under his wing and can talk about it from a very specific perspective. And then we have Dylan Southard, who is a creative director at the VR Playhouse. He's going to talk a little bit about one of the key tools of putting the control back in the director's hands, which is writing. And then we have Joel Dueck, who is the co-founder of Echo VR and the chief scientist at Man Made Music, and has been doing some of the most amazing stuff. Every panel I've been to in VR, everyone's talked about spatial audio, and they've talked about VR sound, and they're talking about how great this is, and it's really going to be great, and then they move on. They don't talk about it. Well, this guy not only talks about it, but he's created some software that helped to sort of jumpstart what's going on in the spatial sound arena, and so I think that's a really important part of the conversation to have when talking about how a director can take the control back into his hands. First of all, let's let each of these guys tell you in a couple of minutes each who they are and what they do. So let's start with Ben.
Ben Smith, I'm the CEO, as Frank said, of Laduma VR. We're a content company based out of the US, UK, and South Africa. Do a lot of work in sports, travel and tourism, health and wellness, and focus primarily on the creation of content, the delivery of that content, and the software solutions around making VR easy for people to view.
Great. Tyson.
My name is Tyson Sadler. I'm a VR filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, as well as a journalist. I've worked in some very extreme environments, having worked for the New York Times, Associated Press, Huffington Post, and as well as Riot, all on immersive VR pieces. I've shot in some very extreme locations. I mean, from the Arctic to illegal open pit gold mines in Ghana to out in the Atlantic Ocean, shooting wild dolphins under the sea. So yeah, a lot of background in documentary VR.
Cool. Hi, I'm Dylan. So I'm the creative director of VR Playhouse. Excuse me, VR Playhouse. So we're a creative studio and a production company specializing in VR and AR and immersive technology of all kinds. We've been around since 2014. We started out doing a lot of 360 video, so you see a lot of our stuff is in sort of branded 360 video content for companies like Honda and Jack in the Box and Toyota and Pepsi and on. And I've also done a number of original and interactive experiences, again ranging from simple 360 video all the way up to game engine, room scale, interactive VR.
I'm Joel Dueck. I'm co-founder of Echo VR, which is a VR company totally dedicated to sound and music. And I'm a composer by training and a sound designer. And we cover kind of both flavors of VR, from live action type stuff, documentary stuff, where we'd also do the location recording and developed workflows to help us capture 360 audio, all the way to game engine based and room scale type experiences.
Great. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions first before I let each of these guys do a little TED presentation of what it is they're going to be talking about, and we'll try and bring it all together in the end. My first question to all of you is VR the new 3D?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Three reasons. One, the content is so different and so game-changing for people to see it that it's not 3D television, which was an augmentation of something that already existed, and a bad one at that. Price point, 3D televisions were really expensive, $3,000 and upwards to watch something no one was particularly convinced about. And the third reason, maybe the most important one, look at the guys around the table and decide if you want to bet against them. And these are the guys that decide how we watch content and when we watch content and what kind of content that is. So if they decide that VR, AR, MR, whatever it is the way to go, then there may not be anything any of us can do about it anyway.
Well, there's no doubt that the big boys are at the table, and they're making the most noise. Anybody else want to throw 2 cents in on that one?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think just to expand on what you were just saying, that I think it's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison because, the more you sort of think about VR and all the related Rs, and really start to think about the sort of applications of it and what it can do, it really is more than just a sort of medium through which you're going to watch something, or a way in which you're going to watch something, or even a new way and a fancy way in which you're going to watch something that'll change the way you perceive what it is you're seeing. It is much more beyond that, and so I think it's far more than the next 3D.
So I want to pose a question to you all and see what the audience thinks about this, because there's not a whole lot of people out there, so I can get individuals to talk about it. But is VR cinematic? Is it theatrical? Or is it something entirely different? I'd like to jump on that one first.
You're looking at me.
You guys,
Well, I think it encompasses all of those things, but, leading on from what Dylan was saying, I think it goes far beyond that because we're seeing its value in the entertainment area, we're seeing its value in training, we're seeing its value in gaming, and now we're starting to see its value in the health sector that's beyond anything any of us kind of imagined, and we can talk about that a little bit. So I think it is much more all-encompassing.
Though I would say if you have to choose between cinematic and theatrical, I would say theatrical. I mean, if you're really starting to talk about, okay, how am I going to tell a story in here, and what kind of stories work in here, and what are the techniques, and because this is an emerging medium, we're all sort of like writing the techniques as we go and building our playbooks both individually and collectively as we go. And so if you're thinking about VR in that sense, my vote is for theatrical, just in terms of looking at it from the point of view of how you're experiencing it. And what it means to be inside of a VR experience. And one of the the first things you sort of realize is that when you're on the side of actually being one of the creators, be it a director or a writer or producer, whatever the case may be, that you have far less control than you would in film or television, in that you're not going to be able to sort of direct their gaze in any particular way, much as you might try, and certainly you don't have the same sort of tools that you do in film, which is to say, like, this shot, and first you look here, and then you look here, and then you look here, and then it's a close-up, and then it's this, and the combination of all those things equals sort of meaning and theme and symbolism. It doesn't work that way. Rather, you're sort of presenting them with a world, and you're letting them explore that world and derive meaning from it in that way, as you're choreographing things, as that world is shifting and changing. And in fact, it's your ability to sort of shift and change the world around you in a very theatrical way. I mean, when people talk about, like, theater is such a good background for VR, and I agree, and I think it's in particular in terms of how a director or a playwright or whoever sort of manipulates the world, on stage, and thinks of it as being an active part of the storytelling environment. How much you see the use of lighting shifts, how much you see the set change, and not because it's realistic, not because necessarily because we're going from day to night, but because it's representing a shift in mood, or it's representing a shift in theme, and using the environment to tell the story. And so in that way, I think it's very theatrical.
So that's exactly the topic of this panel. You've taken us right to it. So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here, and I'm going to ask, since you're a director,
Yeah.
I'm going to make a leap because we just met, that you were a traditional director before you became a VR director.
I was, yeah.
So what tools are there out there now that can put this creative power back in your hands as a director? If you can't say, this is going to be a tight shot and I need this kind of reaction, but wait a minute, I'm worried about the sound coming from behind me or this lighting cue that's happening up there, certain things that I don't have any control over if it's not a scripted piece or if it is an unscripted piece, you have no control over it. So
Right.
what are some of the new tools that are out there that can help you get the power back?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to approach VR. I mean, it's an entirely different beast from traditional, cinematic, whether it's television or movies. It's the difference between, painting a canvas and having a pencil or having a paintbrush. It's just a different tool to be able to tell a story. And when approaching, I think, 360 video or VR, the first question that needs to be posed is just why? Like, why is VR the necessary tool to tell this story? We're well past the stage of doing VR just to do VR. If we approach it in a certain light, it can be very gimmicky, and we want to avoid that. And I think we're several years past the stage where we're doing VR just to do VR, and that's why story has to come first. And it's not just having that story, but it's identifying the story and then being able to, be convinced that VR is the necessary medium to tell this story. So why is immersion important? And so as a director, and recognizing VR as a completely different medium, there's certain considerations that need to be taken into account. While it may be easy, to, I think, shoot just regular 360 video, yes, we're taking into account lighting, we're taking into account, the cameras that we're using, we're doing, preemptively trying to eliminate stitching errors that happen in post-production, and recognizing the role that the viewer plays, is positioned within that scene, and these are some of the factors that come into play as we start to craft this narrative story. So factors that exist within VR that might not exist, in traditional documentary directing or storytelling, is I think really focusing, recognizing that there's a complete absence of frame, and so we need to interject other mediums to be able to direct the gaze of our viewer and have them move through that story, and whether that's through specific lighting that's done on the day of the shoot or in post-production, whether that's done through textual or graphic flourishes in the piece. Certainly with like audio and spatial audio, we can help direct the viewer's eyes and their focus during the story, and I'm quite excited that we've got some audio experts on the panel today.
Well, that's what we're going to
More
do.
about that.
We're going to go down the road and talk about the director's dilemma, the writers, and what they can do with the sound and how that can be brought into it. But I'm going to go back and sort of take us back a step a little bit here and bring in Ben to talk a little bit more in general about how we got to where we got and set this up for us. Just so you know, I want to thank Ben and Laduma, because without them, we wouldn't be doing this panel to this gigantic group of people. I'm just really excited about that. So this was presented by Laduma, and so take it away, Ben.
Well, I guess if you flick one on, we can start with this discussion. And I think Mr. Spielberg would probably feel slightly differently now, having invested in VR himself and featuring it very heavily in his new movie that comes out next year. But at the time, I thought this was a really interesting, way of looking at it. And he described it as a dangerous medium because it gives the viewer a lot of latitude not to kind of focus on what he wants you to focus on. And, my background is in the movie business and then television. And I was fortunate enough to work with some of these guys up here, and the common theme throughout is not cigars, but it is an absolute obsession with detail and controlling their audience's emotions, controlling how you watch a scene in incredible detail. That was a common theme, and I got to see it up close and personal on all of these shoots. And I thought that when you know, Tyson's right, it's a completely different beast. It's a new medium.
Now, Ridley's been working on some VR
Heavily,
stuff.
yeah. Featured it around The Martian and is doing another. Scott Free, I think, are doing 8 films around the world right now, featuring VR or having VR elements in them.
But then they're also getting involved in gaming with these things too. It's not just...
Sure, and look, I think the fact that all of these guys now are aware that VR is not something that's going away is progress in itself. I think at the start there was skepticism and an acknowledgement that maybe it was something that might not stick around. Now, the very best movie directors are trying to educate themselves. You know, they've learned a way of filmmaking from the very start of their careers, and now they're having to think about it all over again. And so, you know...
Do you think that it's that the directors in VR of the future are the linear directors who are going to become VR directors?
Could be,
or
might
are
not
they
be.
going to be VR directors who come into it from that perspective?
There's no rule, I don't think. They could be from theatre, they could be from documentaries. It's people who are willing to understand the new rules that are in play. And losing control is one of those, to some degree.
Is losing control a byproduct of it, or is
Well,
it...
it's having to give up control. Look, from the very start of entertainment in history, the person creating the content has been the person in control. Now you are losing control in that you are welcoming your audience into the story. So, you know, there are challenges in that. For comedy, you know, what if you miss a moment that might be setting up a joke that's coming down the line?
But
in
in
drama,
comedy, though, it may be that you're missing the moment because you're not looking at that time?
yeah.
You're worried about what's in the back of the room or what's on the
And
ceiling?
look, I guess a great director would ensure you weren't,
Yeah.
whether it's in VR or in linear in filmmaking. I think, you know, let's look at, you know, to my point about the historical aspect of control for directors. You know, if Buster Keaton is going to play up there, which he may not do,
Well, I'm going to have to...
this is a guy who did 70 takes to get stuff right because he wanted the audience to be convinced. And this is maybe one of his most famous scenes. But he understood the need for an audience to see something that was real. And technology is going to be us here in the frame.
It's weird. I don't get it. Okay, we'll keep talking.
I'll tell you what happened. shall I?
Stupid 2D stuff.
You know, in his movies, it was all about humour, of course, and it was all of the little intricacies that went into making his jokes work. This was the house falling on him, and if you haven't seen it, I please do go and...
Well, you're not going to see it
No,
here.
you're not going to see it here today. Every little moment within the build-up to the big joke is vital, and it's vital that you don't miss it. So what if you did in VR? Does that come down to a director having to, you know, understand that? Does it come down to a writer writing it in such a way that it avoids a moment like that? Does it change the way you write something? Of course it does. You know, sound is so vital in that instance. I wanted to talk about Mad Max, Fury Road. George Miller, who made the original, wanted to shoot Fury Road in black and white. Warner Brothers told him no, for obvious reasons, I guess. And he has subsequently been given the money by Warner Brothers to go back and make it in black and white, and was released to a very small audience about a month ago. And I went to the screening, and I came out of it, and my wife said to me, I think I understand the story better now I've seen it in black and white. And I said, how's that possible? And she said, well, she felt like she could concentrate on the narrative and the storytelling far more than she could in colour. And that is maybe why George Miller wanted to make it in black and white in the first place. Because although when we watch something in colour, it's fantastic and an assault on the senses, you are distracted by everything you see. An explosion over here, a huge crash over there. when he made it in black and white, what it did was focus you much more on the faces of the characters, the
could
small
do more-
movements
you
in
could
their
do more of the
faces,
lighting, yeah.
the emotions, and actually,
Didn't he do Sin City?
not sure.
Yeah, so black and white?
I think there is something interesting in that, because you look at the great actors, and so often it was the understated look, the glance, the raise of an eyebrow, the twitch of a finger, that decided whether that moment was something that struck home for us emotionally. And the challenge now, I think, for VR directors and filmmakers, and certainly the ones that we work with, is how do you retain enough control to ensure that your filmmaking has all the power, all the comedy, all the romance that traditional filmmaking has, in a completely different way.
You know, you talk about shot sequences that are driven by the imagery, but are also very strongly driven by the sound. So that's the shower sequence in Psycho,
Sure.
which clearly had, I think there were some 70 shots in that sequence. And the sound that was attached to it is a sound that will never be forgotten by anyone. That squeak, squeak, squeak. I think it's almost as good as the first 5 notes of a Seinfeld show. So let's talk a little bit about.
I was going to say Jaws, but
you know what? It's
we
sonic
can go
branding.
there. Yeah.
And there is there is no doubt that that one of the ways that's really important for a director to be able to take back the control, or at least to be able, maybe not to take it back, but to manipulate the control, which is what a director really does, right? In the end, is through sound. Talk to me a little bit about where we're going with that, and why is it so important in the VR space?
Well, I think we need to always remind people that it's so important. I think it's kind of the nature of sound that it's always subliminal in the way we perceive it. And that's just the way our brains are wired. And that's not going to change, and something we have to accept. And so we find ourselves as sound guys really not only evangelizing for the importance of sound, but also asking to be at the table at the earlier stages in the conception of a VR piece. For the majority, if we're not going to like haptic experiences, the majority of experiences, sound is 50% of the experience. And arguably, quite a lot more than that in terms of the emotional content. And it's through the emotional content that you're going to connect with it, that you're going to remember it, and it's going to be meaningful for you. So we want to make sure there's not an afterthought. And the reason why we want to be at the table early is because we can help solve problems for directors. So they're dealing with this 360 space, and the gaze is in front, but we want to basically bring people to look around to behind you. And sound is a very, again, discreet and subliminal way to do that, to manipulate the person, if you like, but to just bring their gaze into a particular place. So we talk a lot about attention directing through sound, and we talk about emotion directing. One of my favorite examples...
Let me interrupt
Yeah.
for just a quick second. Are you finding that the production companies and the directors are welcoming?
Yeah, I think almost every time, particularly in the early days, but still now, when we would kind of find ourselves introduced to people, usually the reaction is, "We're so glad to meet you. Could you help?"
Is that because that they?
It's
had
because
not
they have visual
consciously thought about
backgrounds.
it?
A lot of the VR companies come out of VFX, and so they don't know about it, and they don't really want to know about it. They have their hands full figuring out how to stitch things and how to make it look good. And they realize the value of sound, but it's just a whole other thing. And so, we found, not only they're welcoming, but they're willing to take risks with us and explore things, experiment about spatial versus non-spatial. Yeah.
Have you found the situation where the directors have come to you and said, now how can we take this sound and have it become part of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say every VR piece we do, that conversation has happened or should be happening. We can make a lot of very interesting creative choices. I think one of the things we all tell ourselves working in VR is, don't do it in VR if there's no added value there. If there's no added value, then just, make a movie. So if you're going to do it in VR, there has to be a reason to do that. And those reasons are about trying to, explore the space that you've got. One of the learnings that I think we really, really take to heart is that film, television, even a lot of music, they're all time-dependent art forms. You're always looking at a timeline. And VR is not about time. VR is about space. And so that's one of the shifts in thinking that I think we all kind of go to. And so, yeah, we want to explore that in a very different way.
Are there simply too many opportunities for people to do crap in VR right now because of the big open space?
I actually think
the
it's
space is so big.
In some sense, let's not go to the early. I think the early days of any new art form or technology is going to be a little bit messy and trying to figure out what to do with it. But I think in many ways it's less forgiving than television or film, because it's really, really overwhelming. It's really an intense experience when you're in anybody's VR, creation. And so it's got to be good. It's like, it's like being invited to a crappy restaurant or something. It's like, well, why am I here? It's like, why do you want me to see this? It's very different from just like watching something on your laptop. So I think in a sense we raise the bar higher these days, not only in filming and pushing the envelope on the visuals and on the sound, but on the story. The concept has to be really sound. I mean, it has to be really good. And I think we're all looking at concepts very much these days. It's like, is that worth doing or is it not?
So, Dylan, I would ask you then to tell me a little bit about how do you go about pitching a VR concept in order to get it going? And then what do you have to think about when you're telling that story? What is the storytelling process in VR?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a little different, and I think it goes to what Joel was saying about space versus time. I mean, the first thing I usually, when I'm sitting down with writers and this was a part of what we were doing, like a year ago with VR Playhouse, was like going and finding writers, particularly playwrights, because that was a lot of people in the company's background was in theater and in new play development, so we knew a lot of playwrights. And so we were talking to them about, the differences, and the first thing I would say is that, if you're going back to like your creative writing 101 days and your, how to write a story type of thing, is to like really remember the difference between story and plot, and understand that, in a medium like film and in one that, like Joel was saying, is sort of based on a chronology and based on a set of like cause and effect and causality, and like this happened and then this happened and this happened, and that's your inciting incident and your rising action and your all the little things on the arc, and they sort of follow and they have a certain logic to them, and they're based around sort of events and understanding this happened and this happened in a certain sequence. And in VR, you're not going to be able to execute that kind of thing. You can kind of try to game the system and figure out ways, and that is a part of what making VR and being a director is moving a person's gaze around and choreographing that sort of experience for them, but at the same time to sort of be prescriptive with it and say you must see this in order to then see this, in order to then see this, in order to understand the meaning of this story. A, you're going up against some, it's going to be very, very difficult, and B, you're kind of inherently denying the fun of VR and the essentialness of VR as its own medium, which is that I get to script my own story and I get to look where I want, and every turn of my head is my unique experience, and it's unlike anyone else's experience of this story, because nobody has ever turned their head like this at this moment in this sequence, right? So getting rid of this notion of saying, oh, it's going to be, you're going to outline your story like this, is there's going to be this incident and then this incident and then this incident, is probably is the first thing to think about. And really, again, starting with the sense of space, the sense of environment, the sense of how that environment is going to change, and also remembering that, your viewpoint, the audience's viewpoint is going to be very subjective, and there's no sense in trying to deny that or get around it in some way or pretend that it doesn't exist. Like, they're going to feel as if they're present and they have a subjective part of this world, whether or not they can interact, and understanding that my view of this world is going to be based on my subjectivity, and so it doesn't have to be realistic. Like, you know, I'm not, by and large, I'm not going into VR to get a realistic representation of reality. Like, why would I do that with virtual reality? I can do anything in virtual
I was
reality.
going to say, you get that movie anyway.
Yeah, I get that in a movie anyway. I take my headset off and I get it. I can see what the world looks like. I want to see the world in a different and unique way, and so basing it around that subjectivity, basing it around a character and presence in this world and saying, how does this world look like to you in this moment, is a really, is a good way to start thinking about this sort of story creation process. And then, I always say, like, the whole medium is moving towards interactivity. So there's the notion that there's going to be 360 videos where all you do is look around and that's the end of it, is those days are ending pretty fast. And so for writers, and if you're coming from a more traditional medium, starting to really get a sense of interactivity and like really starting to play video games. If you know what I mean? And thinking about video games in a very critical way, and how those stories, how stories are constructed in video games, how they're communicated in video games, the kinds of themes that are sort of played with or experimented or discussed in video games, and thinking of it as an artistic medium and as a way in which you can sort of communicate really big themes, and what it means to interact with that medium, and how you derive meaning from your interactions, and what you can touch and what you can change and how you can impact things. It doesn't have to be this full-on complicated branching narrative where everything intersects in these very clever and complicated ways. You're going to probably drive yourself a little insane if you try to do it that way. But even if you just sort of understand the meaning and the meaning behind just being able to interact with something, just being able to touch something, just being able to impact the environment in that way, that unto itself is telling a story. It's not a story that's rooted in plot. It's not a story with this sort of very constructed beginning and middle and end. It's much more, again, up to the audience. And as a writer, you're going to have to get comfortable
Well,
with
I was going to say, how do you
want
write?
to-
I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, do you not think the audience need guidance? Do you not think they crave guidance? And actually the freedom to do what you want may be slightly disturbing in that, for the history of entertainment has told us that as an audience, this is where you look and that's what you want. And I think to some degree the audience need and want that.
I agree, and I certainly think it's the balance. That's what we're sort of continuing to figure out in this medium, is where do you strike that balance? And that's definitely, if you're looking at like immersive theater as a sort of foundation for VR storytelling, that's always been my thing with immersive theater, which I'm really into and have done a lot of and worked on, is that even in the best of them, at a certain point, you get to that point where like, well, somebody should tell me what I'm supposed to do. Like, where am I supposed to go? Like this.
But
like
usually
this.
there are some guides around that will help you.
Well, that's what
in
they're kind of
immersive
figuring
theater.
If
out.
the writer
right
and the audio and the director have done their job, then they shouldn't be asking that question.
Right.
If the writer, the direction, and the sound has done
Well,
their
then
job.
that makes me, you're
But there's not very many good immersive theater directors. and
That's what I
writers
was just
yet.
going to
That's
ask
the
you. Are
thing.
you starting, because you're talking to these other writers and these other producers and directors who are coming in and talking to you about their projects. Are you finding, because I'm listening to you talk about, you sound like you're at that level way past, hey, I did it, I was a director, a writer, a producer in a linear world, and now I am all of that in a non-linear 360 kind of a world, and you're not even thinking about the old rules and how they applied to what was then in terms of what is now. I mean, you've got a thought process now. Are you finding people coming in that have got that thought process, or are we still in that phase of this nascent industry that people are still trying to learn from what they used to know?
I think they're still, by and large, kind of trying to learn from what they used to know, but I think it's getting better and better, or I think this sort of the magnitude of what we need to sort of learn and build and develop and create for ourselves is becoming apparent in actually a very exciting way, and not in a daunting like, oh my God, we're fucked way, but like in a really exciting way that says, the old rules do get we get to throw them out. We don't have to abide by them, and we can trust in our audience. I mean, that's the thing we're learning is that, we can put a tremendous amount of faith in our audience, and this is, at this stage in the history of the world, all of us get stories all the time. Like literally 24 hours a day, stories, we're being bombarded with story. So we understand the beats of story. Like we don't need to be told this is the beginning, this is the middle and end, like this is a love story. Like we know it already. And so we can kind of like skip past all that kind of stuff. And how we do that, and the various like effective ways and ineffective ways to do that is still being figured out. But
I actually want to talk to Tyson a little bit about the role that the editor has with the director in a VR world. But before we do that, can I ask, give me some examples of successful dramatic VR programming. Have you seen anything that you want to say, you know what, you got to watch this? Is there anything out there?
I don't want to get off track with it, but I feel like I do want to mention it. There's one piece in particular called The Collision that was produced by Jaunt. And the reason I think it's interesting, I want to mention it, is because it's neither documentary nor narrative. It's somewhere in between the two. And I think that's a place that VR seems to do very well because, if you shoot a documentary in 2D, you watch it basically as a documentary. In virtual reality, you're in it. And so you're bringing something to that experience that is beyond the regular observer kind of status that you have in a documentary. And I think it's also a much more accurate reflection of real life because, our lives are part fact, a part documentary, like we started at 1 o'clock and we'll finish at 2 o'clock. And these are facts, a series of facts that we know. But also we bring our feelings and our emotions and our stories to everywhere we go. And so I'm finding that that's a really interesting place that seemingly VR is able to tell better than anything I've seen before, and where I'm particularly fascinated in this area between narrative and documentary. Now, I know I haven't answered your question, but I feel that this particular piece has a lot of dramatic character to it, and not in a very typical sense. So that would be kind of my number one choice.
That's exactly what I wanted. Does anyone else have something, maybe, Dylan, you can give me an idea of something that's been well written in the VR space?
Yeah, I got a couple. I mean, and they're both pretty like popular, so maybe people have heard of them. I thought Dear Angelica it told a story in a way that felt very much unique to VR. Like you couldn't tell that story in that way in any other medium. It used the visual and the audio of VR in very unique and very emotional ways. It wasn't trying to sort of blow your mind with technical, wizardry. It was just it understood the emotional capabilities of being inside of this headset, and it really took advantage of something that I think gets overlooked a lot in VR storytelling, which is intimacy. Like there's a lot of sort of thinking about like, all the kind of stuff I can put everywhere. And sometimes like the real power of VR is that like you're alone inside of this headset. And if you've got one thing to look at, the connective power of that one thing, I mean, everybody talks about the real power of when somebody looks you in the eye in VR, and it really is quite a moment because you do feel that sort of connection. And I feel like Dear Angelica sort of accomplished that in interesting ways. And the other one I would say is, and it's been around for a few years now, but I always thought Gone, which was this sort of interactive mystery that Samsung did early on, was really clever in terms of defining a kind of interactivity that didn't feel like a game, but felt like a new kind of interactive storytelling, which was taking aspects of game design, most especially this idea of like giving you an intention and saying your job is to do such and such, and giving you challenges and encouraging you to repeat certain things in order to gain more things, but at the same time was telling a story in 360 video, was giving you the option to just sit back and passively watch it, but you could choose to interact with it, and it just felt like it was sort of inventing cool new rules that were very much just for VR.
I think great VR, in the sense that you're talking about, it doesn't just allow us to be in a place, but it also allows us to be a participant in the environment that we're in. And one recent film that I saw that really struck me, is allowing us to enter this space and also be a very emotional actor participant was a film called, a VR film called Tree. It was at Sundance, it was at Tribeca. You begin as this small little seed in the rainforest. You realize very quickly that you are the seed. You get planted, you have your controllers, and so you're actually the branches of this tree. And throughout the next 8 minutes, you end up growing, as a tree out of the ground, and and it's multi-sensory because you can actually smell the soil, and then you grow, and you can smell like the water and the leaves, and as you grow higher, just the scent changes over the next 8 minutes. And I didn't realize how emotionally involved I was in this film, until the end. I mean, I felt a sense of pride, that I had grown. I mean, I was hundreds of feet above the floor. I could see my arms and I could move them, and I was the branches. And this, spoiler alert, I am going to give it away here. But the film culminates at this point where a couple of assholes down below start a fire, and there's nothing that I can do about it. And I start smelling, like fire, and I'm like in me, like I'm getting pissed off. I'm just like, you pieces of shit, like stop, like you were killing us. I was so emotionally involved because I was just so proud of what I had become, and then to feel that somebody was destroying me and my environment. I've never been so emotionally involved in a film. Please check out Tree if you guys have an opportunity.
Wow,
Because
okay, I'm going to go do that. Ben?
you are the story.
I saw Invisible recently, made by 13 Ninjas, Doug Liman, a feature film director turned VR director, based on the Philip K. Dick novel, which I thought was brilliant and actually interestingly shot in 180, not 360, which, I'm not 100% sure the reason, but, kind of taking back a little bit of that control, knowing that actually the area behind you is not something that it takes any of your attention. It's all happening in 180 degrees in front of you. And it's actually, that subject has come up a lot in recent conversations with directors who are talking about, the focus being here and no longer being there. So there's a few VR directors are now shooting in 180 with that in mind. But I thought Invisible was excellent. I definitely recommend it. Broken Night as well, which starred Emily Mortimer, was released at Tribeca. Really interesting way of kind of having a very interactive kind of plot, I guess, that gives the user control of how they view it. Broken Night. Yeah.
So that's some really good stuff for you guys to go out and take a look at, and I think that a lot of those things will absolutely give you some sense of what the dilemma is for the director in VR. But there's other tools besides writing and music and lighting and graphics that we can talk about in the few minutes that we have left, because I'd like to let the audience ask some questions. Well, as a matter of fact, why don't we go right out to the audience now, sir?
Just real quick, could you guys speak to distribution systems that those pieces are on? Because that's probably one of the toughest things, finding where this content actually lies.
Yeah, and that's a wider issue. I mean, everyone's battling to be the definitive platform, as you know, right now. And it was the same with music until iTunes came along. And I guess it will be the same with VR until Apple come along and redefine the landscape. And it was a critical moment for downloads, actually having a place where everyone could go. And I agree, it's a massive issue. Invisible's on Jaunt. Broken, I think, has a website where you can download the content. I'm not 100% sure, but if you go, they have a purpose-built website.
Yeah. Tree, if it's not out, I'm not sure if it's actually been released to the public, but when it does, it'll be on the Vive.
Yeah, and are you just curious about where these pieces of content are distributed, or in general, sort of?
Yeah, I was just making sure.
Yeah, I think Dear Angelica's in the Oculus store. I mean, I think you need a Rift, but maybe it's on Steam at this point. I don't know.
You can do Vive.
Is it? Huh? Yeah. So it's all over the place. And Gone was on the Samsung platform and probably still is. That was just a 360 video, so that you can do just with the Gear VR.
And Collision is on Jaunt, but only on the app. They don't want people to see it on what we call flat VR, if you like, browser-based. You know, it's a bit like, you know, Felix and Paul as well. It's like, it's not made for that kind of a medium, so they don't want to seem like that.
You make a good point here, talking about the various distribution platforms and also the various types of gear that you can look at a piece with. So is it that, John, is somebody using, you know, when Magic Leap comes out, what change is that going to make? When Apple does whatever it does, what change is that going to make? The point is that you've got mobile-based ones, you've got better mobile-based ones if you're talking about the use of non-iOS systems, so Android systems, which have the better of the mobile-based VR. But then you've got things that require that you're attached to a cable. You know, there's some that are required that you have sensors on the right and the left-hand side of you so that you can make handheld devices do something. There's all these different ways to get this content now. Bringing it back to the idea of the director, every one of these different ways has a different way of presenting the content. So how do you, as a director, determine which device you're going to shoot your stuff for?
Yeah, right.
It's also the capacity.
But I mean, you know, if your stuff is living online, for example, like on a YouTube page, you can monetize that. Even if nobody knows who you are, you can monetize that. But is it? That's the key question with VR. Where is the money?
Good question.
Yeah, no, does anyone know?
Ben has the answer.
Ben's got that
Well,
answer.
Maybe this guy's got the answer.
No, I mean, thanks for coming, you guys. I really appreciate it. I'd like to hear what your experience is with agencies, top-tier agencies, your responses, the receptivity, and can you tell us a little bit about that from your experience?
Yeah, we deal a lot with agencies. You know, a lot of the money right now in VR is with the brands. You know, Dylan will tell you. I think, you know, right now our guys are shooting a project with HSBC. You know, these kind of brands are the ones bringing the money, and often to get to the brands, you've got to deal with the agencies. And right now, the agencies want to paint themselves as a solution for VR, even if they don't have it in-house. In terms of the dealings with the agencies, I think right now we're in a place where most agencies feel like they don't know enough about VR to give over a decent chunk of creative control. It's basically a hand-holding exercise when we deal with agencies. They know the client's interested. They want to, you know, be all things to all their clients, and that includes VR now. So they seek out somebody like us. They bring us in right at the start of the creative process to generate the idea of how we actually maximize the opportunity and make sure, you know, as all the guys have said, that it's worth doing in VR, right through to the shoot and in some cases the delivery and activation. So, you know, we've had positive experiences with agencies. I think, you know, that they do very well because of their trust and those long-standing relationships with people with big budgets, and that means that, you know, a lot of us will have to deal with agencies until such a time that agencies start buying VR companies, which I don't think is that far down the line, or that the brands realize they don't necessarily need the agencies if they want to create a piece
So are
of it.
we still in a situation where it sounds like, you know, we need to be in VR, so go do something for me in VR because
Yeah.
we need to be there.
All the time.
It's almost like the old days of the agency when a client would come in and say, I need a viral video.
Yeah, look, we talk about being in the post-WoW era. We're definitely in the post-WoW era as far as I'm concerned. Certainly within the industry, everyone feels that, you know, no one's going to put on a headset and be blown away by the fact that they can look behind them anymore. But the reality is, in the mainstream, people still are, every day. Agencies still are. Clients with big budgets still are. And so a lot of our job is to steer them away from, wouldn't that look great in VR? Yeah, it would, but, you know, where's the return for your brand? How is it going to help you? You know, are your audience going to come back for more once they've seen that? Probably not. So it's an education piece right now, away from wouldn't it look great in VR to let's do something that really
But
has a chance of succeeding.
You say it's an education piece, but I also think it's a marketing piece, and
Yeah.
and it seems to me that if you were to say drama, comedy, news, sports, drama, comedy, news, sports, training, and the area that VR is going to live in stronger right now is not going to be drama and it's not going to be comedy. it's going to be more in, this is a question, it's going to be more in the shooting of and the distribution of content that aftermath of a news story, something that's going on the football field live. It's almost like events are more suited towards it. Am I wrong? Or marketing, because everything seems to be a marketing play.
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly there's marketing. I mean, I think there's a lot of value, and there's a lot of analytics to back up the sort of interest in 360 video on like just on YouTube or on Facebook as just something that people will click on, and they'll click through and they'll watch the whole thing, and they're more engaged than they would be with a regular framed piece of content. And for a big brand that has some money to throw around for marketing, and if they have some sort of big campaign that they're launching nationwide and they want to, and it's part of their brand identity to say we're young and cool and tech savvy, and so yeah, they're going to put, they're going to make a VR content. They're not going to expect a return on that investment. That's going to just come right out of marketing, their marketing budget. Now, there's not a lot of companies in the world that have budgets that size that can do it, and that's the struggle right now. But yeah, that is sort of a large part of the content. And the other thing is just talking about the agencies. We're represented at William Morris, and it was a huge thing for us when we were. And in terms of a lot of our conversations with our agent there and in working with that agency is about getting their influencer talent involved in terms of original content, which is a whole world that I'm just now still getting, familiar with and comfortable with. But they see content, a lot of people see content in the same way that YouTube content sort of became monetized and became its own thing, and now is its own ecosystem and has its own stars, and these people who are the stars know how to work within that system in a way that is very successful and very different from television or film distribution or games or anything like that. And so not only because those are the kinds of people that the audience that the VR industry wants, those are the kinds of people that audience is into, but also because they are familiar with making the kind of content that lives very easily on VR, which is, I mean, the news stuff is another really good one because you can crank it out, and because you want it to feel immediate, and you want it to feel like you're right in the middle of it. And in some ways, the sort of YouTuber influencer content is the same way. They can crank that stuff out. It's about sort of connecting with their fans independently, creating this sense of this intimate relationship between them and their fans, and VR is perfectly suited for that. So from the talent agency side, that's what we hear a lot is like, how do you, here's our influencers, here's our digital talent, how do we get content for them?
We have time for one more question from the audience. Okay, maybe two. This young lady over here first.
It's more for audio, actually. Since VR is not like a movie where there's cuts, and so writing music to the image is very different. So how do you go about it? Is it more mood-based, or is it like you want to convey the emotion, but you can't really go to?
I think that we tend to ask a different question first, because one of the abilities that we have in VR is to have a spatial sound. That's your diegetic sound. And then your non-spatial, so that's your headlocked, as we call it, or non-diegetic. And that's typically where you'd put the musical score or something like that. Because you don't want, you're listening to your orchestra or whatever, and then you turn around and all of a sudden the orchestra's gone there. So we asked the question about what are we going to do that's diegetic and what's non-diegetic. I think we haven't really explored very much yet the possibilities of bringing the sound out there in the world in meaningful ways and having maybe that interact with the typical, more traditional way of doing a score. But I think there's interesting areas there. I mean, we did a music video with these guys where we were able to, for example, create a spatial environment. You're going through space, and there's asteroids and all this kind of stuff like that. And the song itself of the music video, we were able to get access to the stems, and we could pull out the lead vocal and the background vocal and set them out when there was a visual reference there. You could see the singer. And that, again, gave a purpose for doing it in VR. Otherwise, why do we bother? So I think It's a completely open territory. I put it back to you as, finding reasons to bring it out into the space and also making that work with the non-diegetic versus diegetic. I think it's so interesting that we're actually thinking of starting a competition for immersive audio, immersive music, to help stimulate this whole kind of area. The tools are free for the most part, yeah? So anybody can do this, and I think if I present it to composers imagine that you don't have to be restricted by the boundaries of stereo or even surround sound, but you can write music in any way you want, and make it interactive or participatory just by looking at it, or in a really deep game engine type way. There's so many possibilities there. We haven't really begun.
So I want to thank everybody for coming and thank Laduma for sponsoring this great panel. I wish more people had been here because I thought some of the stuff you guys had to say was pretty amazing. Ben Smith from Laduma, Tyson Sadler, director, Dylan Southard, writer, Joel Dweck, audio extraordinary in the VR world. Thank you all for coming.